Hi everyone, this is Ms. Romani, and in this lesson, we're going to explore the topic of public health by taking a look at the science of epidemiology. What is epidemiology? Epidemiologists are often called disease detectives because whenever there is a disease outbreak, the science of epidemiology is actually used to identify both how the disease is spread, how the disease started, and to determine how to control or stop the disease, and maybe even prevent it from happening again. It is both a combination of science and detective work. And many different types of scientists work as epidemiologists, not just biologists. For example, there are doctors, of course, but there's also veterinarians that work as epidemiologists, mathematicians that work with the math and the numbers of epidemiology, zoologists that take a look at diseases that are spread by animals, ecologists, and a whole bunch of other health professionals. And usually the work is carried out by health organizations like the Public Health Agency of Canada, which is the agency of the Canadian government that deals with the epidemiology and the detecting of disease. If you're looking at the worldwide, this is the World Health Organization, or WHO, which is actually an agency of the United Nations. And if you're looking at the US, for example, there's the CDC, or the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, which is the American branch of epidemiology that looks at disease and how it is spread. So, the work that epidemiologists do have literally changed the world over the last 200 years. 200 years ago, the top three causes of death were basically infectious diseases. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and diarrhea basically made up most of the deaths that occurred in populations. And today, by contrast, especially in developed countries, infectious diseases are much, much lower on the list. As a matter of fact, other than the flu, typically, um, and pneumonia, which is often caused by the flu, infectious diseases do not make it even in the top 10 of the causes of death in developed countries. So they are not a leading cause of death. It's usually heart disease, cancer, nowadays more and more diabetes and injuries, which are basically lifestyle caused diseases as opposed to infectious diseases. And we have epidemiology to thank for this change. Before improvements in sanitation, before vaccines, before antibiotics, many, many people did not survive childhood. Um, and even if they did, they often died of infectious diseases later on. In 1820, the global average life expectancy was only 25 years old. Now, that doesn't mean that people died at 25. It means that the average life expectancy was 25 because so many people died when they were infants or children, and very few made it into adulthood, that the life expectancy was really low. Thanks to public health measures, thanks to uh, the eradication or near eradication of many diseases, thanks to the works of the World Health Organization and epidemiologists the world over, um, the global life expectancy in 2019 was 72 years old. So it's a significant improvement in life expectancy, and we have public health measures and epidemiology to thank for that. So one of the main things that epidemiologists do is they gather data, especially when there's a disease outbreak. So they gather a few different types of data, and one of the things that they look at is something called the morbidity. The morbidity is essentially the number of people that are infected. So we've been looking at a lot of data. Probably, if you're like me, every so often you might take a look at some of the data for COVID-19. And so I figured I'd just bring that out to kind of illustrate some of the statistics that epidemiologists gather. And so when we're looking at the morbidity of, say, COVID, we're looking at the total cases that we have. So when we say, for example, this is some data that I pulled a couple of days ago, the total coronavirus cases in Canada, that would be the morbidity, right, of COVID in Canada. And the other set of data that they pull, which is a little bit more morbid, is the mortality. And the mortality is how many people have died of the disease. So that would be when we take a look at the total deaths due to coronavirus in, say, Canada. So the morbidity is the number of infected. The mortality is the number that have died from the disease. Now, this data then can help us provide information on another couple of data points, and that is the incidence of the disease and the prevalence of the disease. So the incidence of the disease is the number of new cases during a particular period of time. So if we take a look, for example, at the daily new cases in Canada of the disease, well, that's the incidence. The period of time that we're looking at is a 24-hour period, but it could be longer, it could be monthly new cases, yearly new cases. In this particular case with this disease outbreak, we're often looking at daily new cases. Well, that's the incidence, the number of new cases during a period of time. The prevalence, on the other hand, is actually a very good measure because it doesn't tell you the total number of infected. It gives you a proportion of the infected based on the number in a particular portion of the population. So let me give you an example. This is a chart that I just put up here that shows the number of cases comparing the US, well, in the world first, but the US and say Spain, okay? Both the US and Spain have the greater number of cases right now for different countries in the world. Now, the US has 909,000 cases. At the time, that was a couple of days ago. So a couple of days ago, they had 909,116 cases. And at the same time, Spain had 219,764 cases. So the US obviously has way more cases than Spain. However, if we take a look at the total cases per 1 million population, you will notice that per 1 million population, the US has less than half the number of cases that Spain does. And the reason for that is because Spain has a much smaller population size than the US. So the prevalence of the disease, the proportion of infected in a population, can give you a much better idea of how widespread the disease is. So the incidence conveys information about the risk of contracting the disease by telling us how many new cases we see daily or weekly or yearly, and the prevalence gives us an idea of how widespread the disease is in a particular population. Okay, so for example, I have this chart here that shows both a couple of numbers related to HIV/AIDS in the US. And so the first one starts to show, notice that it starts in 1980 because that's basically when the disease started. And the blue line shows new HIV infections, whereas the red line shows active HIV infections. So the blue line shows the incidence of the disease. So what that tells us is even though the total number of HIV cases in the US continues to grow over time from 1980 to 2010, there was less of an incidence of the disease in 2010 than there was in 1985. Notice that in 1985, that blue line is higher. That means that there was a greater risk of being infected in 1985 as opposed to now in 2010, right? So that helps. All right, so there's another related branch of science called etiology. And etiology is actually study not the spread of a disease, but the cause of the disease. So they're the scientists that work in a lab and they try to figure out when there's a new disease that appears, what is the agent that causes the disease? Is it a bacteria? Is it a virus? Is it a protist? Which is it? So etiologists basically perform experiments and determine the cause of the disease. So when the new cases of corona appeared, etiologists were the ones that basically identified the virus and eventually named it, right? Now, I don't want you to think that epidemiologists only study diseases that are spread through viruses and bacteria. As a matter of fact, epidemiologists study a variety of different health problems, not just diseases. For example, they are, of course, in charge of following the path and studying the spread of infectious diseases, but they can also be studying the spread of environmental exposure. So, for example, lead poisonings or heavy metal poisonings that can happen in a population. So, for example, when with the lead poisoning in water that they find in Flint, Michigan, epidemiologists would have been are probably busy following that situation and seeing what is happening there. It could be air pollutants. It could be injuries if there's an increase in homicide rates in a community or domestic violence incidents. They are in charge of following that as well. Um, any kind of non-infectious diseases as well, like cancers and diabetes or major defects, birth defects, or basically, anytime there's a particular health problem in the population, epidemiologists are in charge of studying that, following the spread, pinpointing the cause, trying to stop the spread, and essentially just help fix and guide the fixing of the problem that is occurring in public health. For this course, however, we're going to focus on the epidemiology of infectious diseases, and those are diseases that are caused by pathogens, often called microbes or germs. They can spread throughout a population. So, for example, diseases like the flu, malaria, Ebola. We're going to focus on how they're spread. So, for example, from person to person, by sneezing or coughing, or even through other mediums like by eating contaminated food or water. And we're going to then talk about um, the different methods by which these diseases can spread in the population so we can get a better idea of how they can be prevented. Um, so, before we begin looking at disease spread, let's talk about the different types of infectious diseases just so we can get a better understanding of that. And I'll warn you, um, some of these slides can be a little bit gross because they are slides with pictures of different diseases. And in particular, this first one is going to show you shingles. And so it shows the little blisters for that. And some of you might be grossed out by that. But let's start with the different types of diseases. And we'll start with latent diseases. And latent diseases are basically diseases that are caused by pathogens that can remain inactive in the body for a long period of time, not causing a disease, but then sporadically basically wake up and cause the disease, or you can get infected by the disease, you have no symptoms for a long time, maybe even years, and then suddenly the symptoms appear years later because the oftentimes a virus has remained in what is called the latency or latent stage within your cells. And usually these are diseases that are caused by viruses that have a lysogenic cycle, right? Ones that can insert their DNA into your DNA and then just sort of lay dormant there until something wakes them up. And a common example of that is the herpes virus. So let's take a look at, for example, the herpes virus that causes shingles, which it also causes the common disease called chickenpox, and it's called the herpes zoster virus. And so this is what shingles looks like. It's tiny little, very painful blisters. If you ever gotten cold sores, it's also very similar to that because the cold sores are caused by another type of herpes virus. And these type of viruses basically can cause disease much later after the first infection. So oftentimes what happens is people might have chickenpox when they're children, but then as adults, maybe in their 50s, they will get shingles because the virus reawakens as the patient's immune system gets lower as they age or so, or for other variety of reasons. Okay, so that's latent diseases. In comparison to latent diseases, you have what are called acute diseases. Acute diseases are diseases basically that develop symptoms very fair or relatively quickly after infection, and they run their course within a fairly short period of time. So they might develop symptoms within a day to maybe a few weeks after the first exposure. But then once you develop symptoms, the symptoms might disappear within, less than a month, less than 3 months or so. A common example of that is, say, the common cold or a flu, in which you basically get sick fairly quickly after exposure, and then you run through the symptoms and get better soon after. And the opposite of an acute disease would be something called a chronic disease. A chronic disease does not develop symptoms quickly. As a matter of fact, it develops symptoms slowly, and those symptoms do not get over very quickly. They usually last a long time, at least 3 months, for symptoms in a disease for the disease to be considered to be a chronic disease. So, for example, arthritis or heart disease, those are chronic diseases. The symptoms for the diseases appear slowly, but they last oftentimes for a lifetime. But any amount of time over 3 months would make a disease to be considered chronic disease. Another disease category is the difference between communicable and non-communicable diseases. So non-communicable diseases are diseases that are basically not spread from one host to another. So they're not spread in the community from person to person or by being infected by an animal that is in the community. These may be caused by what are called opportunistic pathogens, um, pathogens that reside somewhere outside the body and are just basically waiting to enter the body in order to cause disease. A very common example of that is tetanus. Tetanus is caused by a bacteria called Clostridium tetani. And this bacteria actually is a soil bacteria. People often confuse tetanus and think that it's going to be found in like rusty nails. And I know I have a picture here of someone almost getting stabbed by a rusty nail. And the reason why tetanus is associated with rusty nails or rusty metal is not because the bacteria is found in the rust, but because what happens is in order for the bacteria to get from the soil into your body, it has to enter through a wound. So if you get injured by a dirty piece of metal, then you're going to have a deep enough wound in which soil that is often in dirt or in the dirty piece of metal can get into your body. But it is a soil bacteria. Okay. Another category of diseases are called opportunistic diseases that cause what are called opportunistic infections. And think about it in terms of like the disease waiting for the opportunity to cause disease. And I know this is a really gross picture, but what this is showing is a disease called thrush. And thrush is basically a yeast infection. In this particular case is thrush of the mouth. And you can see the tongue is covered with that white pasty stuff. That's the yeast infection. It's actually very common in babies because their mouths are often have like large amounts of sugar from milk, and babies don't brush their teeth often, and so they very often develop thrush, and it's not dangerous. It's just you know a yeast infection that might cause maybe itchiness, and it will go away on its own. But the reason why this is called an opportunistic infection is because the organism is actually always in the body or on the body. It just sort of waits for the right conditions to grow in greater numbers. So we always have a certain amount of yeast both on our skin and in our body parts. And then if the conditions are right, then that provides the opportunity for the yeast infection to get out of control and to grow in greater numbers than it would be normally. So it's not like you're getting a yeast infection because you've just been contaminated by someone else, although it can become communicable as well. It can be passed on from person to person, but oftentimes it's just because the yeast was there, and then either the pH balance of the body changed, or there was just more sugar, or the immune system was lowered, or sometimes when people take antibiotics, the antibiotics killed the bacteria, the good bacteria in and on our body that help keep the yeast under control, and then suddenly the yeast can go out of control and you end up with a yeast infection. Another category of disease is then communicable disease, which is the opposite of non-communicable. Communicable diseases are those diseases that we're more commonly used to. Those are the diseases that can be passed on from one person to another or from one host to another. And so this is what we call contagious diseases, like, for example, the flu or COVID-19, right? So when we're taking a look at communicable diseases, we also have to take a look at the fact that not all communicable diseases follow the same pattern. There is a similar pattern that a lot of them follow, but they can vary. So usually there's this period of communicability, and that is basically how long a patient is contagious, and that can vary for different diseases. Now, typically, a disease will have what is called an incubation period. And oftentimes, the disease is not contagious during the incubation period. During the incubation period is basically the time between the invasion of the pathogen into the body and the start of the first symptoms. And most people are not contagious during that time for most diseases. But there are diseases that are actually contagious during the incubation period. So this is not a hard rule. It all depends on the disease. A lot of diseases, though, become more contagious after the incubation period once they enter into either the subclinical or the clinical stage, which is basically when the symptoms begin, when you start showing the early signs of fever, fatigue, coughing, sneezing, and so on. That's when the period of communicability goes up, and that's because coughing and sneezing, which are the most very common symptoms, allow for the spread of the disease. But keep in mind, though, there's a lot of diseases that can also be communicable or contagious in the incubation period. And so usually a disease will run its course. If it's not a chronic disease, if it's an acute disease, it might last maybe 2-3 weeks, maybe a little bit less than that. And then the patient enters what is called the convalescent period, where the signs and symptoms of the disease recede, the person returns to health. Oftentimes, for most diseases, once the symptoms disappear, it is not as contagious. But for some diseases, you might still be contagious even into the convalescent period. And unfortunately, there are some diseases that continue to be infectious even after the host is better. And the host may become what is called an asymptomatic carrier or chronic carrier of an infectious disease. I don't know how many of you were reading during the discussion forum. There was a story that I put out about Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary, whose name is actually Mary Mallon, was a woman, an Irish immigrant in New York, who was an asymptomatic carrier for typhoid fever. She was not sick with typhoid fever, but she was, for the entirety of her life, the whole duration of her life, an active carrier of the disease, and she managed to pass on the disease to many people before she was basically stopped by being placed in quarantine for the rest of her life. And so, different diseases follow different patterns, and that's the take-home message here. All right. So when we're monitoring the spread of disease, we're going to be using different terms to basically describe how a disease spreads. And we might see terms like sporadic diseases, endemic diseases, diseases that are epidemics, and a term you're familiar with, I think right now it's called pandemics. And basically, if we go from sporadic to pandemic, we're talking about it in terms of increasing amounts of the disease, with sporadic disease being the least number of cases and pandemic being the most number of cases, or at least the most spread out of all the cases. Okay, so let's start by looking at sporadic diseases. And these are diseases, like I said, that are seen only occasionally and usually without a geographic concentration. So it's not like you see a huge number of cases and in a particular area. Usually, the greater the population, the greater the cases, because these are diseases that just appear, occasionally. Like, for example, tetanus. Tetanus appears every year in throughout, say, for example, the United States, and the cases are just based on the number of injuries that people get, and when those injuries get dirty with tetanus infected soil. The next level is endemic diseases. Endemic diseases are basically diseases that are constantly present in a population at any time in a certain number of levels. So, for example, malaria, which is actually a huge problem in a lot of countries, is considered to be an endemic disease to tropical regions of the world. That means that there's always a certain number of malaria cases in those regions of the world at all times. And so let's talk a little bit more about malaria in detail. So malaria has been around since ancient times. There is no known start to the disease as far as history goes back. There's always been malaria cases in tropical areas of the world and continues to this day. Mostly it's focused on areas around the equator, and that is because the disease is transmitted by a mosquito that can only survive in tropical areas. The mosquito cannot survive the cold areas of the world. So, it is sort of limited its spread by the temperature at which the mosquito is able to survive. The agent that causes the disease, so the actual pathogen that causes it, is actually not the mosquito. It's a protist. It's called Plasmodium, and it's a protist that lives inside red blood cells. And it is transmitted, though, by a host, and the host is a mosquito. So the mosquito carries the malaria from humans to human. The malaria parasite, the protist, needs to finish its reproductive cycle inside the saliva of a mosquito and then moves into the red blood cells of humans that way. The symptoms of malaria are fever, chills, headache, unfortunately, sometimes coma, and for a lot of people, death. It is a deadly disease, although most people with malaria survive malaria. There is, a lot of people who don't. And so that brings us to both the morbidity and the mortality of the disease. So the morbidity is about 200 to 500 million cases per year. So there's a lot of cases of malaria every year. And the mortality is about 400,000 people or so, usually a little bit over 400,000 people. Most of them, unfortunately, children that die from malaria. Okay, so another disease category is disease outbreaks. And outbreaks are basically a word that we use when we're describing a sudden increase of a disease. So this is when we have a disease that maybe is at endemic levels or sporadic levels, and then suddenly there's a lot more cases. So for example, if you look at this graph, you can see the cases of measles in Canada. And in the 1990s, we actually had gotten the measles number of cases in Canada down so low that basically it was declared eliminated in Canada. It had achieved elimination status by 1999, where it was determined that hey, there's no more measles in Canada. And then suddenly we started to see little clusters of cases going up. And in 2011, there was a particularly bad outbreak of measles in Quebec, where we had like a huge increase in the number of cases. So this is what we would call an outbreak. So when you suddenly have a jump in the number of cases of a disease where the numbers were lower before. Okay, so outbreaks can sometimes lead to what we call epidemics. And epidemics occurs when an outbreak of a disease spreads rapidly through a population. So for example, in Haiti, there was an outbreak of cholera following the 2010 earthquake. And that outbreak led to thousands and thousands of cases of cholera with, more than 2,000 deaths and 88,000 cases recorded in a fairly short period of time. And an epidemic can become a pandemic when it spreads worldwide or close to the whole world to be declared to be worldwide. And so an example of that is obviously COVID-19, which, it's the current pandemic that we're going through, where as soon as it spread in enough numbers in the world, that the World Health Organization declared a pandemic. And so let's take a look at one very famous pandemic you might have heard about already, which is the Great Influenza or the Spanish flu, which, by the way, was called the Spanish flu not because it started in Spain. As a matter of fact, it is believed that the first case might have been in the US. It is called the Spanish flu because the time when the flu was happening, which was 1918 and 1919, it was right at the end of the First World War. And a lot of countries had bans on the publication of the disease because they didn't want to incite panic amongst the population. However, the Spanish newspapers did not have any bans enforced on them, so they were able to report on the disease. And because the first reported cases of the disease in the public media came from the Spanish newspapers, it was named the Spanish flu, but it didn't start there. So the disease happened basically within a 6-month period at the end of the First World War. It spread worldwide, aided by the war because of ships traveling back and forth, bringing troops from America to Europe and throughout Europe to fight the war. And then even, unfortunately, at the end of the war, bringing those soldiers back home, spreading the disease everywhere. The agent of the disease was the influenza A virus, a particular type of influenza virus also called the H1N1 virus. You may have heard that there was relatively recently, a few years ago, an H1N1 outbreak as well, and it was particularly scary because it's the same strain of virus that caused the Spanish flu. The symptoms of the disease are obviously flu symptoms, fever, chills, headache, and so on. But it led to pneumonia and bleeding from the lungs, nose, and ears, and unfortunately, quite a high death rate. The morbidity of the disease was 500 million in a 6 month period. So, in a 6 month period, and 500 million reported cases were tracked. Obviously, it could be more than that. Not every case ended up getting tracked, but reported 500 million cases, and the mortality was over 50 million. It's hard to know exactly because of the time that it came at the end of the First World War, but the estimates go at the very least 50 million people died from the Spanish flu, but it could be as much as 100 million. And this is the end of this lesson. Next lesson, we're going to take a look at how disease spreads through a population and how we can maybe stop disease from spreading. Talk to you later.